unimaginable in 1998. Phones were traced, metadata analyzed, patterns mapped with precision, revealing networks and routines that had gone unnoticed before. The man had been careful, but time and innovation were catching up, and the threads he thought securely buried were unraveling, inch by inch, pixel by pixel, sample by sample. One late evening, a detective replayed footage yet again, the glow of the monitor reflecting in tired eyes. A shadow paused, shifted, the angle just right to reveal a hand, a sleeve, a shoe, details that no one had noticed before. Each revelation was a jolt, a surge of adrenaline, the kind that makes a seasoned investigator lean closer, heart hammering, aware that they are standing on the threshold of history. Interviews with relatives painted a picture of normalcy peppered with anomalies. Stories of sudden disappearances, unexplained travel, of obsessions with news clippings and unsolved crimes. Small quirks that had seemed irrelevant at the time now took on an ominous significance. The detectives began to assemble a timeline, minute by minute, reconstructing the night of Emily's disappearance with painstaking accuracy. Each movement, each interaction, each unseen glance added to a tapestry that was dark, complex, and chillingly coherent. The city, meanwhile, seemed to lean in, holding its collective breath. Streets once familiar became eerie, facades of ordinary houses now suspicious, lights flickering in sync with the detectives' findings, the wind carrying whispers of long-forgotten secrets. And then came the breakthrough. A neighbor recalled seeing a package left at the alley entrance, a bag that had been overlooked, hastily discarded, but now analyzed for trace evidence, revealing fibers matching Emily's clothing, dust from the alleyway, a microcosm of the night's events preserved against all odds. The pattern was undeniable. The man had been there. He had touched, moved, concealed, leaving only enough traces to tease discovery, enough to tantalize the persistent, unyielding hand of justice. DNA evidence, corroborated by genealogical tracing, led to the creation of a profile so detailed that detectives could almost imagine the man's habits, his routines, his psychological architecture, an ordinary life overlaid with extraordinary darkness. Each night, investigators pored over the data, maps spread on tables, timelines intersecting like constellations in a night sky, patterns emerging from chaos, revealing a predator hidden in plain sight for 25 years. And still the city waited, a collective pulse of anticipation, the hum of streetlights and traffic carrying the tension into every corner. Every lead was a jolt, every confirmation a shock, each step toward resolution heightening the suspense, the dread, the almost unbearable sense that revelation was imminent. Emily's family, long resigned to grief, clung to hope, the detectives' cautious optimism rekindling a spark they had thought lost forever. Friends, neighbors, even casual observers felt the weight of the moment, as if history itself was turning, shaking free a secret that had bound the city for a generation. The man, meanwhile, remained under surveillance, his daily routines monitored, his interactions scrutinized, unaware that the walls around him were closing in, that time had finally caught up with patience, that his carefully maintained anonymity was dissolving under the relentless pressure of modern investigation. Anonymous tips, once discarded as irrelevant, were re-examined, forming patterns that confirmed suspicions, pointing conclusively toward him. The detectives coordinated, moving methodically, planning every detail, preparing for the confrontation that had been 25 years in the making. And the community, watching from a distance, felt the tension as if it were a living thing. A presence moving through the streets, through homes, through offices and cafes, a tangible anticipation of justice long delayed. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, technological breakthroughs, all converged into a singular narrative, a story that had begun in shadows and silence now emerging fully, terrifyingly, beautifully precise in its revelation. The detective in charge reviewed the files one last time, each photograph, each note, each trace of DNA, visualizing the night, reconstructing the movements, anticipating the reactions, understanding the psychology, preparing for the confrontation. And in that preparation, the enormity of what had been achieved, and what was about to be confronted, pressed down, a weight both thrilling and chilling. The city's pulse seemed to synchronize with theirs, every heartbeat a reminder of the stakes, of the decades lost, of the lives affected, of the relentless persistence that had refused to allow a cold case to remain cold. Emily's voice, in memories, in photographs, in the echoes of stories told, seemed to guide them, urging them forward, reminding them of the human cost, the necessity of closure. And as the night deepened, as the wind rattled windows and carried the distant wail of sirens, the detectives moved toward the moment of confrontation, the moment when the careful, hidden life of a killer would collide with the patience, skill, and unwavering determination of those who refused to let time erase justice, knowing that the confession, the revelation, the shattering of silence was just ahead, waiting, inevitable, unstoppable, a culmination of 25 years of fear, mystery, and relentless pursuit. Shadows deepened in alleys, lights flickered over streets long familiar, and the city, silent yet attentive, held its collective breath, waiting for the truth to emerge, for the dark corners to be illuminated, for the cold case to finally speak its secrets aloud, for Emily Sanders' story, long obscured by time and fear, to be fully, horrifyingly, finally told. The chill in the Chicago air seemed to seep into every building, every alleyway, every hollow space where secrets had waited silently for 25 years. Detectives moved with deliberate precision, their breath fogging in the dim glow of streetlights, eyes scanning for patterns, listening for echoes that might reveal a life carefully hidden in plain sight. The man they were watching remained outwardly unremarkable, his routine predictable, almost banal, but every detail they had gathered painted a different picture. A meticulous, patient predator who had mastered invisibility, blending into the rhythms of the city while the memory of Emily Sanders lingered like a shadow no light could fully erase. Inside the precinct, files were spread across tables like an intricate mosaic, evidence meticulously categorized, photographs annotated, notes cross-referenced. Analysts ran digital reconstructions of that night in 1998, every second mapped, every movement calculated, until the trajectory of events was as clear as the alley where Emily had vanished. Security footage, once grainy and inconclusive, was enhanced frame by frame. Shadows that had been dismissed now revealed subtle gestures. The tilt of a head, the flick of a sleeve, a bag held too tightly, a hesitation that betrayed familiarity with a place most people ignored. Fiber samples from clothing, soil traces from the alley, microscopic particles once overlooked. Each piece told a story, a narrative of proximity, of presence, of involvement. And the detectives pored over them, night after night, eyes red, minds sharp, hearts hammering with the thrill and terror of revelation. Outside, the city seemed to lean in, its buildings towering like silent witnesses, streets humming with distant traffic that masked the tension seeping through neighborhoods. Neighbors had begun to notice subtle shifts, a light left on when no one should be home, the faint sound of movement in hours of darkness, a car parked unusually long on a corner. Whispers circulated quietly, fear threading through casual conversations, a collective sense that the city's pulse was synchronized with the investigation. The detectives reached out to long-forgotten witnesses, people who had moved away, changed their numbers, tried to bury the past. Some spoke willingly, others hesitated, memories returning in fragments, flashes of shadowed movements, moments they had dismissed at the time as nothing. Each recollection, no matter how small, was another piece of the puzzle, and together they began to form a chilling portrait of the night Emily disappeared. A neighbor remembered seeing a man near the alley, not once but twice, pacing slowly, glancing toward the street, carrying a bag with an almost obsessive care. Another recalled hearing laughter, distant, carried on the wind, the sound abruptly cut off, replaced by silence so complete it had unsettled her even then. Those pieces, combined with the anonymous letter, the security footage, the DNA evidence, converged toward a single profile, a man who had lived quietly, invisibly, while the memory of his crime lingered in the minds of those he passed every day. Detectives constructed a timeline, mapping his movements, anticipating behaviors, projecting opportunities. They understood his routines, his habits, his patterns of interaction, all while maintaining the outward appearance of normalcy. They understood the mind that could harbor darkness for decades, patient, calculating, waiting for a moment of vulnerability or distraction. Surveillance intensified. Cameras captured even the smallest deviations from routine. Every footstep was recorded, every interaction noted. The detectives' notebooks were filled with observations, predictions, subtle shifts in behavior analyzed for significance. And then came the moment when the man's carefully maintained control began to unravel. A discarded receipt, overlooked at first, suggested a deviation from routine, a stop at a location that fit the reconstructed timeline of Emily's disappearance. Cross-referenced with phone records, it painted a picture of movement too deliberate, too precise to be incidental. The detectives recognized it immediately as a crack in his armor, a thread they could pull. They followed it, tracing connections, validating patterns, confirming the presence of a mind that had orchestrated an absence so complete it had fooled generations of investigators. Emily's family had long ceased to believe in closure, but now hope flickered again, fragile yet persistent. They were interviewed once more, photographs brought out, memories reawakened, small gestures remembered. The tilt of a head, a laugh, a glance, that provided subtle context to the evidence that had been accumulating. The community watched from a distance, caught between fear and anticipation, sensing that the long shadow of this cold case was finally approaching resolution. Tips from the public, once ignored, were re-examined with care, and some aligned perfectly with the reconstructed narrative. Anonymous calls were traced more accurately, leading to corroboration of certain behaviors and movements that had previously existed only in theory. And then the man, the elusive figure at the center of it all, made a mistake. A phone call, intercepted legally, revealed a pattern that contradicted the narrative he had carefully maintained for decades. A neighbor's casual observation, once dismissed, now gained critical significance. Each tiny error, each subtle inconsistency, became another arrow pointing directly at him, and the detectives tightened the circle, anticipating his next move, predicting his patterns with almost clinical precision. The tension was suffocating. Every day brought new revelations, and yet, the man remained outwardly composed, blending into the city, unaware of the net closing around him. The detectives coordinated with federal agencies, ensuring that when the moment came it would be decisive. Strategy meetings lasted hours, evidence reviewed repeatedly, contingencies planned for every possible scenario, for every potential outcome. They understood that one false step could compromise the case, that a single miscalculation could allow decades of evasion to continue. And all the while Emily's absence loomed large, a ghost guiding their steps, a memory driving their persistence, a silent witness to every procedural choice, every analysis, every painstakingly reconstructed moment. The city seemed to hold its breath, streets hushed as if aware that a confrontation was imminent, that the silence of 25 years was about to be broken. The detectives rehearsed the final steps mentally, visualizing the confrontation, anticipating resistance, preparing for the confession that they sensed was near but could not yet force. And then in a quiet precinct office late one night, after reviewing evidence for what felt like the 100th time, a breakthrough emerged. A single photograph from an old security camera, enhanced with modern technology, revealed a fleeting glance, a posture, a hand gesture, so subtle, so insignificant to an untrained eye, that it had been overlooked all those years. But in context, combined with the fibers, DNA, letter, witness statements, and behavioral patterns, it became undeniable. The man had been there. He had observed, concealed, waited, and now the detectives had proof that connected him irrefutably to Emily Sanders' disappearance. The realization sent a ripple through the team. The cold case, long dismissed as unsolvable, had a tangible lead, a path to closure that had eluded them for decades. Plans were solidified, arrest strategies mapped with precision, the timing of surveillance and intervention coordinated to minimize risk and ensure that the moment of confrontation would be final. The detectives understood the gravity of what they were about to do. They were stepping into a situation that had been decades in the making, confronting a mind that had eluded justice through patience, cunning, and careful manipulation. Outside, Chicago slept unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors, streets empty, lights dim, the wind carrying distant echoes of a city oblivious to its long-hidden truths. Yet the detectives could feel it, the tension, the weight of anticipation, the almost tangible presence of history pressing down as they prepared to move. Every detail mattered. Every observation, every pattern, every piece of evidence could make the difference between success and failure. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the team mobilized, aware that today could mark the end of 25 years of uncertainty, the end of a nightmare that had haunted Emily's family, friends, and the city itself. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each member understanding their role, their responsibility, the stakes higher than anything they had encountered in their careers. And all the while the city held its breath, every street, every alley, every shadowed corner waiting for the inevitable revelation, the confession, the final chapter of a story that had remained unfinished for too long. A story that would finally, terrifyingly, fully be told. The early morning fog clung to Chicago streets like a shroud, muffling the usual city noise, creating a hush that seemed almost intentional, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside the precinct, the team moved with tense precision, eyes scanning every monitor, ears straining to catch the faintest sound over the hum of computers and the occasional click of a keyboard. The man at the center of the investigation was no longer an abstraction, a shadow in old photographs and DNA reports. He was a living, breathing figure, minutes away from being confronted by decades of scrutiny and persistence. Surveillance cameras had mapped his morning route with almost obsessive detail. His coffee shop stop, the newspapers he glanced at, the joggers he nodded to, every subtle gesture cataloged, analyzed, cross-referenced against old behavioral profiles, feeding the detectives a story that was terrifying in its ordinariness. This was a man who had spent 25 years perfecting invisibility, and now, he was about to face the weight of every second, every choice, every action he had taken in the shadow of Emily Sanders' disappearance. The detectives moved as one, a choreography honed over years of experience and countless simulations, knowing that timing was everything. One wrong step, one hesitation, and decades of effort could unravel. Outside, the streets were almost deserted, the fog lending the alleys and corners a spectral quality. Shadows loomed larger than life under dim streetlights, every movement magnified, every echo intensified. Inside the surveillance van parked strategically nearby, monitors flickered, displaying live feeds from cameras capturing him from every conceivable angle. The man paused, glanced down an alley, then continued on his routine, unaware that his world was about to collapse. Detectives in plain clothes followed at a distance, every footstep calculated, every glance coordinated with teams watching remotely. The tension in the van was palpable, a thick, almost suffocating layer of anticipation. Then came the call. A breakthrough in the database cross-check, linking him irrefutably to the fibers, the hair, the soil, the alley, every piece of evidence painstakingly collected over decades. The confirmation reverberated through the room. Months of planning, years of persistence, and a lifetime of evasion were about to meet their inevitable conclusion. Officers quietly assembled, checking equipment, reviewing procedures, mentally rehearsing the approach. The man entered a building, his face calm, routine unaffected. But every step he took had been logged, every movement predicted, every reaction anticipated. The detectives knew this was the moment. The moment when history, patience, and modern forensic science would finally confront a shadow that had loomed over Chicago for 25 years. Teams positioned themselves strategically, corners watched, exits covered, communications checked. The building was surrounded, a silent web of containment waiting for him to make the first move. Inside, he went about his morning, completely unaware that the past he had buried was closing in, that the web of evidence painstakingly constructed had formed an inescapable cage. The detectives held their breath, knowing the importance of timing, the danger of alerting him prematurely. Then the first knock came. A measured, deliberate sound on the door. Silence followed. Another knock, firmer, authoritative, echoing in the hallway. The man froze. For a moment his composure cracked, a flicker of awareness in his eyes. But he masked it quickly, moving to the door, opening it just slightly, peering out. The detective's voice was calm, commanding, but edged with the authority of someone who had waited 25 years for this moment. "We need to speak with you. You're not under arrest yet, but we have questions about Emily Sanders." His hand trembled slightly as he closed the door to grab something. Maybe a bag, maybe papers, but the motion was enough. Officers moved in with precision, hands on. Weapons but ready to adapt, ready for the unthinkable. The man stepped outside, gaze steady, composure returning, but every fiber of his being now under scrutiny. He knew something was coming, though not the full weight of what had been discovered, not the convergence of decades of evidence that left no room for escape. Detectives approached, calm but firm. Every word, every gesture measured. There was no rush, no theatrics, just the quiet inevitability of justice closing in. Questions began. His alibi, his movements that night, people he had seen, places he had been. Each question was precise, grounded in evidence too substantial to ignore. He responded, measured, careful, but under the weight of accumulated proof, cracks began to appear. The fibers, the DNA, the security footage, the timeline, all converging, forming a narrative impossible to deny. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each second a silent drumbeat, echoing the intensity of the investigation. Outside, the fog seemed to thicken, enclosing the scene in a cocoon of suspense, muting the city's usual din, heightening the drama unfolding in real time. Finally, the confession came. Not shouted, not dramatic, just a voice, calm but resolute, acknowledging actions long hidden. The darkness he had carried for 25 years now spilling into light. Emily Sanders' name, uttered at last in the confession, hung in the air like a physical weight. The detectives recorded every word, aware that this single moment validated decades of work, perseverance, and relentless pursuit of truth. The city, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind closed doors, continued its rhythm, unaware that the veil of mystery over a cold case had been torn apart, exposing secrets too long concealed. Emily's family, notified immediately, experienced an impossible mix of relief and shock, grief mingled with vindication, the past crashing into the present in an emotional wave that had no precedent. News outlets would later describe the confession as chilling, almost surreal, the culmination of 25 years of waiting and wondering, the shattering of silence in a single deliberate voice. Detectives stayed calm, professional, but the weight of the moment pressed on them too. Every piece of evidence, every painstakingly traced lead, every sleepless night of review, was validated in that confession. The man, now fully aware of the inevitability of consequences, remained outwardly composed, but the tension was palpable, the psychological burden of decades of concealment finally reaching critical mass. Interviews with neighbors, witnesses, and family members were conducted immediately afterward, filling in the narrative with nuance and detail, humanizing a story that had been dominated by shadows and speculation for too long. The confession confirmed theories long held, resolved questions that had haunted investigators, and illuminated patterns of behavior that, in retrospect, seemed almost inevitable, a trajectory of darkness that had eluded scrutiny for a generation. And while justice had finally been served, the emotional weight of the case lingered. The city had been haunted by this disappearance for 25 years, and though closure had arrived, the memory of Emily Sanders, the echoes of her life abruptly ended, and the long shadow of fear and uncertainty it cast, remained deeply embedded in the community psyche. The detectives, exhausted but resolute, reflected on the journey, the evidence painstakingly gathered, the evolution of technology, the persistence required to confront a case that had gone cold in every conceivable way. They knew this moment was historic, not just for law enforcement, but for the city itself, a reminder that patience, diligence, and unwavering commitment could pierce even the most carefully constructed veil of secrecy. Outside, as the sun rose over Chicago, the fog began to lift, revealing streets and alleys bathed in the pale light of morning, ordinary again but forever marked by the events now fully exposed. Emily Sanders' story, long suppressed, had finally been told, her name etched into headlines, records, and the memories of those who had waited for justice. And yet there was a lingering unease, a reminder that darkness can endure, that patience can conceal, and that vigilance is required even when closure seems complete. The confession, chilling in its calm delivery, reverberated through precincts, households, and newsrooms alike, a stark reminder of both human malevolence and human perseverance. 25 years had passed between disappearance and resolution, and every moment in between had been a testament to the interplay of fear, hope, grief, and determination. The detectives documented every facet meticulously, ensuring that the case file, now resolved, would serve as both record and cautionary tale, illustrating the lengths to which evil can hide and the lengths to which justice can pursue. Emily's family, finally able to grieve with the closure of knowledge, reflected on the intervening decades, the unanswered questions, the nights of worry, the attempts to forget but never fully succeed. The confession did not erase the past, but it illuminated it, provided a narrative, a form of reconciliation between memory and truth. The city, now aware of the resolution, processed the shock in its own rhythm. News cycles churned with updates, reporters dissected every detail, neighbors recounted the tension of the investigation, and social media buzzed with disbelief and relief. Yet beneath the surface, the alleys, streets, and buildings that had held shadows for decades now stood silent witnesses to a story that had finally emerged. The detectives, having orchestrated the culmination of years of work, continued to monitor, document, and analyze, aware that even with the confession, procedural diligence was paramount. The balance between emotion and professionalism was delicate, the adrenaline of resolution mingling with the exhaustion of the journey, creating an almost surreal atmosphere within the precinct. And as the day unfolded, as Chicago returned to its usual rhythm, a quiet understanding settled over the city. A cold case, frozen in time for 25 years, had finally cracked, the shadow lifted, yet the memory, the lingering presence of what had occurred, and the chilling reality of human deception endured in the collective consciousness, a reminder that the past, no matter how long buried, can always resurface, demanding attention, acknowledgement, and reflection. The confession had come, the shadow finally lifted, but the city of Chicago remained unsettled, as if the very air had absorbed decades of tension and could not release it all at once. Streets that had once felt ordinary now seemed steeped in memory, each corner, each alleyway recalling the absence of Emily Sanders, the laughter that had once echoed and then vanished into silence. Detectives, though outwardly composed, carried a weight beyond paperwork and procedures. They had orchestrated the culmination of 25 years of investigation, but the human consequences, the emotional resonance, were a different matter entirely. Emily's family emerged from the initial shock into a world colored by a mixture of grief and relief, a duality that was almost impossible to reconcile. The mother, once resigned to decades of uncertainty, now found herself flooded with memories of her daughter, every smile, every shared secret, every argument, replaying in vivid clarity. She wondered how the years might have been different had justice come sooner, how the absence had shaped not only Emily's life, but the lives of those who loved her. Her father, stoic through decades of uncertainty, finally allowed himself to break, tears mingling with the gray winter light filtering through the living room window. Friends scattered across the country and beyond, reconnected, drawn together by the news of resolution, sharing stories long untold, reconciling laughter with tragedy, joy with grief. In the precinct, the detectives cataloged every element of the confession, ensuring the integrity of the legal process, documenting psychological profiles, corroborating every detail, aware that even decades later meticulousness could not be compromised. They understood that the confession, while climactic, was merely a component of a larger narrative, a narrative that included the trauma, the absence, the societal impact of a crime left unresolved for a generation. News outlets covered the story with urgency and intensity. Headlines screamed, images of Emily smiling, now aged with memory in the minds of those who knew her, juxtaposed against photographs of the man, calm, ordinary, yet harboring darkness that had remained hidden for a quarter century. Social media erupted with disbelief, horror, fascination, and the inevitable reflection on human nature's capacity for both evil and resilience. Analysts dissected the timeline, revisited old interviews, and explored the subtle signals that had been overlooked, drawing lessons for future cold cases. In neighborhoods near the scene, residents experienced a renewed sense of awareness and caution. The alleys, the streets, the corners where children had once played now carried a memory that demanded vigilance, a reminder that darkness can linger quietly, almost imperceptibly, for years. Psychologists weighed in on the societal impact of long unresolved crimes, noting that the lingering uncertainty of a cold case could haunt not only families but entire communities. Chicago itself, resilient yet scarred, processed the event collectively. Coffee shops, workplaces, schools, the conversation drifted toward Emily Sanders, toward the fragile balance between normalcy and vigilance, between forgetfulness and memory. The detectives attended debriefings and interviews, their own reflections threaded with both professional pride and personal exhaustion. They had navigated decades of silence, pieced together fragmented clues, observed patterns invisible to the untrained eye, and exercised patience that had finally culminated in confession. And yet they were acutely aware that confession, while powerful, did not undo trauma, did not restore lost time, did not erase the haunting absence that Emily's disappearance had created in the lives around her. Her room, preserved by family as a sanctuary of memory, became a focal point for reflection. Every photograph, every book, every memento took on heightened significance. It was a place of grief, yes, but also of commemoration, a tangible connection to a life cut short yet never forgotten. Friends shared recollections, moments that had seemed trivial but now resonated with profound meaning. Laughter in a corner cafe, whispered secrets in hallways, fleeting glances that now were etched with a deeper poignancy. Community meetings were held to address the emotional fallout. Counselors offered support. Neighbors spoke candidly about the tension that had gripped them unknowingly for years, about the subtle unease that lingered in alleyways and streets long after Emily vanished. In schools, teachers discussed the importance of vigilance and empathy, weaving lessons from Emily's story into broader conversations about safety, trust, and communal responsibility. Legal teams prepared for the prosecution. Evidence meticulously documented over decades was now paired with the confession, forming a formidable case against a man who had lived quietly, invisibly, and yet whose actions had irrevocably altered the lives of many. Psychological evaluations aim to understand not only motive but mindset, the duality of ordinariness and calculated darkness, the patience and precision that allowed a crime to remain unsolved for 25 years. The detectives themselves reflected on their professional journey. The evolution of technology had been critical. Advances in DNA analysis, forensic enhancement, genealogical databases, all combining with traditional methods of observation and investigation to achieve resolution. Each advancement highlighted the interplay between persistence and innovation, patience and adaptability, in uncovering truths long concealed. And yet, despite resolution, unease lingered. For the people of Chicago, Emily Sanders' story became a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that patience can cloak the darkest acts, and that vigilance is a communal responsibility. The fog of memory, once thick and impenetrable, had lifted, revealing clarity tempered by horror. The detectives conducted interviews with the suspect, extracting details of movements, psychology, and premeditation, each confession adding depth to the narrative of that night. Every word, every pause, every detail was preserved, analyzed, and recorded, forming a comprehensive account for posterity. The family, finally able to reconcile with long-delayed justice, experienced a mixture of closure and enduring sorrow. Grief, which had been suspended in uncertainty for a quarter-century, now became tangible, anchored to the factual narrative revealed in confession. Community vigils were organized. Candles flickered in alleys and parks, residents gathering quietly to remember, reflect, and mourn. The story transcended a single family, touching the consciousness of a city, and in a broader sense, a generation that had grown up with the silent knowledge of a life stolen and a mystery unresolved. Media attention continued to ripple outward, journalists interviewing detectives, neighbors, and experts in criminal psychology. Discussions centered on persistence, methodology, and the extraordinary patience required to solve cold cases. Social media provided a platform for shared grief, discussion, and analysis, creating a virtual community processing shock, relief, and empathy simultaneously. The detectives returned to the precinct after long hours in the field, reviewing recordings, compiling reports, and debriefing one another. Each detail had to be perfect, every fact verified, not only to ensure legal integrity, but also to honor the life whose absence had driven the investigation. Emily Sanders' story, once a collection of fragmented memory and unanswered questions, now stood as a coherent narrative, chilling yet complete. And yet, the residual tension was undeniable. The city had been haunted, the community affected, and the psychological imprint of the crime lingered. Children who had grown up playing in nearby streets, adults who had walked those alleys, friends and family, everyone carried a trace of that night, now made concrete through confession. As days passed, discussions shifted to prevention and vigilance, highlighting the importance of community involvement, forensic innovation, and intergenerational awareness. Neighborhood watch programs gained renewed attention. Law enforcement emphasized the importance of reporting, observation, and cooperation. Emily's family participated in interviews and public speaking engagements, sharing insights, warning others, and commemorating her life in a way that transformed personal tragedy into a public lesson. The detectives, meanwhile, prepared for the trial, ensuring that the confession, evidence, and psychological profile were presented with clarity and precision. Legal teams strategized for prosecution, anticipating defenses and counterarguments, understanding that the weight of decades-long evasion demanded a meticulous approach. Throughout it all, Chicago absorbed the events slowly, collectively grappling with the reality that a mystery that had lingered for 25 years had finally been resolved. Reflection and analysis permeated the city's consciousness. The human capacity for patience, cunning, and concealment contrasted with the determination, ingenuity, and persistence of law enforcement. And in quiet moments, when the bustle of the city receded, the memory of Emily Sanders' laughter, her absence, and the long shadow of fear and hope lingered. Streets, alleys, parks, and corners, once mundane, remained etched in the public memory, reminders that resolution does not erase impact, that confession brings clarity but not the return of what was lost, and that the past, no matter how long buried, leaves traces that endure. The detectives, weary but fulfilled, walked through the precinct halls, aware that their work had made history. Their names, their methodology, and their persistence would be remembered not just for the resolution of a cold case, but for the demonstration that even decades of silence cannot withstand meticulous, patient pursuit of truth. Emily Sanders' story, while tragic, became emblematic of resilience, dedication, and the enduring power of justice. Yet beneath the closure was a subtle, persistent unease, a reminder that darkness can endure quietly, that ordinary lives may conceal extraordinary malevolence, and that vigilance, patience, and courage remain essential in confronting the shadows that persist in even the most familiar places. The city moved forward, but the echo of that night, of a life lost and a mystery solved only after a quarter-century, remained. Emily's memory became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of persistence, the confession serving as a bridge between absence and understanding, grief and closure, mystery and revelation, ensuring that her story would never fade entirely, that the lessons learned from one cold case would resonate across generations, in neighborhoods, precincts, classrooms, and hearts forever marked by the chilling yet illuminating path of justice pursued relentlessly, patiently, and unyieldingly. Even as the confession echoed through precinct halls, even as the city absorbed the shock and relief of a cold case finally resolved, there remained a weight, subtle yet omnipresent, that no amount of legal closure could erase. Chicago, a city accustomed to rhythm and routine, had been forever altered by the decades-long absence of Emily Sanders. Streets, alleys, parks, corners, mundane locations transformed into landmarks of memory, etched into the collective psyche of those who had lived through uncertainty, doubt, and fear. Detectives returned to their offices late at night, the glow of monitors casting long shadows on the walls, replaying the confession, examining the nuances of body language, intonation, hesitation, all the subtle cues that hinted at a mind both calculating and unervingly calm. Each word the man had spoken was dissected, recorded, archived, a testament to the convergence of patience, innovation, and persistence that had finally pierced the veil of silence. Yet alongside satisfaction was unease. 25 years of evasion had left psychological imprints not only on Emily's family, but on every layer of the city that had, knowingly or unknowingly, lived with a shadow. Teachers recounted the whispers of children, young adults who had grown up playing near the alley, learning through subtle fear and anecdotal caution that the world could harbor hidden threats. Neighbors, once dismissive of strange sounds, odd movements, or fleeting shadows, now recounted with detail and urgency every anomaly they had observed, every nothing moment that now seemed laden with significance. Psychologists examined the long-term impact, the subtle erosion of trust, the anxiety woven into the routines of daily life, the latent trauma that had spread invisibly through households and social networks. Emily's parents, while relieved by confession, navigated a new terrain of grief intensified by the clarity of knowing. The ambiguity that had allowed hope to linger for decades had now transformed into a stark confrontation with reality. Memories once softened by distance sharpened, each anecdote of her laughter, her warmth, her presence now tinged with the weight of irreplaceable loss. Friends who had once shared casual dinners, late-night conversations, and spontaneous adventures now convened in solemn reflection, acknowledging the absence that had shaped their own adult lives, recognizing the void left in the wake of unresolved tragedy. And yet there was also connection, a deepening of bonds forged through shared grief and the acknowledgement of resilience. Community meetings were convened in local halls and parks, small gatherings where stories were told aloud, voices trembling, pauses heavy with emotion, creating a collective space for memory, mourning, and reflection. Law enforcement continued their work meticulously. The confession, while pivotal, did not conclude the procedural journey. Every statement was verified, every assertion corroborated with material evidence, witness testimony, and forensic data. Detectives returned to the alley where Emily had vanished, examining each brick, each stain, each surface for lingering clues, no matter how minute. Soil samples, fibers, and minute traces of materials long forgotten were collected, scanned, and analyzed again, revealing patterns previously unnoticed. Even the simplest items, a scrap of paper, a discarded object, a mark on a wall, were scrutinized, each holding the potential to enhance understanding of the events that had unfolded so many years ago. The man's movements were reconstructed in painstaking detail. Forensic analysts overlaid maps, timelines, and witness recollections to create a virtual rendering of the night in question. Every deviation from routine, every choice, every hesitation painted a portrait of intent, method, and psychological disposition. These insights provided closure not only legally but intellectually, illuminating a pattern of behavior that had been hidden in plain sight. Outside the precinct, the city itself seemed caught between normalcy and memory. Streets carried the weight of reflection. Passers-by occasionally glanced toward familiar alleyways, recalling vague recollections of childhood fears, stories from neighbors, or newspaper clippings kept in drawers for decades. Local historians began cataloging the events surrounding Emily Sanders' disappearance and eventual resolution, preserving narratives, photographs, and artifacts to ensure that future generations understood both the crime and the societal impact of long unsolved mysteries. In homes, photographs of Emily were revisited. Childhood friends and family members lingered over images that once brought joy, now tinged with sorrow and admiration for her life. Every small detail, a smile, a tilt of the head, the glint in her eyes, became a touchstone, a reminder of what had been lost and what had endured through memory and storytelling. For detectives, the work extended beyond the technical aspects of the case. They engaged in reflection, counseling, and debriefing, acknowledging the emotional toll of pursuing a case that had spanned decades. The human aspect of investigation, the empathy required to navigate grief while maintaining objectivity, had become as critical as the forensic and analytical tools employed. Interviews were conducted with those peripheral to the crime yet impacted indirectly. Neighbors who had once doubted their own observations, friends who had forgotten seemingly minor interactions, colleagues who had been unaware of the undercurrents present in everyday life. Each conversation added depth to the narrative, providing context for the community's prolonged psychological engagement with the case. Media outlets continued coverage, balancing sensationalism with sensitivity, highlighting both the procedural achievement and the enduring emotional impact. Discussions centered on cold cases as phenomena that ripple through communities, the importance of meticulous investigation, and the necessity of societal vigilance in the face of concealed malevolence. Across social networks, conversations oscillated between horror and admiration, shock and respect for the investigative process, analysis of behavioral patterns, and reflections on the lingering fragility of trust in everyday life. In schools, discussions emerged organically. Educators used Emily's story to foster awareness of personal safety, communal responsibility, and critical thinking. Children were guided to understand the nuances of risk and observation, taught that while the world can harbor danger, vigilance, awareness, and community action can prevent, detect, and resolve threats. And yet, despite resolution, subtle unease persisted. Shadows that had once seemed ordinary now carried historical weight. Alleyways, streets, and parks were no longer neutral spaces. They were memorialized psychologically and physically as loci of both tragedy and eventual justice. Community rituals, vigils, remembrance gatherings, public talks became methods of reconciling the tension between horror and relief. They provided collective processing, a forum for reflection, mourning, and acknowledgement of resilience. Detectives participated not only as professionals but as custodians of memory, guiding families, neighbors, and colleagues through understanding, ensuring that every piece of evidence, every trace, every confession was preserved not merely as documentation, but as testimony to the human capacity for endurance, patience, and pursuit of truth. The man's psychological profile was revisited repeatedly. Experts analyzed not only motives but the patterns of concealment, the extraordinary patience, the meticulousness, the interplay between ordinary life and hidden darkness. Discussions emerged on the nature of criminal behavior extended over decades, the implications for prevention, early detection, and intervention. Emily Sanders' life, though tragically cut short, became emblematic of resilience and the enduring power of memory. Her name was etched not only in legal records but in the consciousness of Chicago, a symbol of the potential for justice, the necessity of vigilance, and the profound human cost of delayed resolution. Detectives documented the case for training and posterity. Lessons were extracted, methodologies formalized, best practices highlighted for future cold cases. The case became a benchmark for how decades-old crimes could be approached with modern technology, methodical investigation, and relentless perseverance. And through all this, the emotional narrative persisted. Families, friends, and communities were engaged, their experiences documented, their grief honored, their reflections preserved. The balance between closure and residual trauma was delicate, acknowledged in counseling sessions, public discourse, and private reflection. Streets returned gradually to their ordinary rhythm, yet the memory lingered, an invisible thread weaving through the city's consciousness. Emily's story, once shrouded in uncertainty and fear, had emerged fully into light, yet it carried with it the haunting acknowledgement of what had been lost, of what remained irretrievable. And in the quiet moments when the city's hum softened, the echoes of that night, the footsteps never retraced, the laughter frozen in time, and the shadow of absence were felt most acutely. Chicago had witnessed the resolution of a cold case that spanned a quarter of a century, but the emotional, psychological, and social reverberations would endure indefinitely. Emily Sanders' story remained alive, a narrative of tragedy, resilience, persistence, and justice. The detectives, the family, the community, all participants in a drama that stretched across decades, carried forward lessons that transcended the particulars of the crime. Vigilance, empathy, patience, and the unyielding pursuit of truth, even when the world seemed indifferent, even when time itself appeared to conspire with darkness, even when the shadows of the past stretched long and deep, only to be finally illuminated by the light of human perseverance, meticulous investigation, and unwavering moral resolve. Even as Chicago attempted to return to its ordinary rhythm, the city remained subtly altered, as if the very streets and buildings remembered the absence that had haunted them for 25 years. Residents walked with an almost imperceptible vigilance, memories of Emily Sanders' disappearance lingering at the edges of consciousness, coloring interactions, shaping perceptions, influencing choices. Detectives, while processing the immediate aftermath of confession, continued to follow minor threads, small details overlooked in the initial reconstruction, faint anomalies in the timeline, subtle inconsistencies in witness recollections. These fragments, though seemingly minor, held significance in the broader narrative of closure and understanding, illuminating patterns of behavior and missed opportunities that could inform future investigations. Neighborhoods, particularly those near the alley where Emily had vanished, became spaces of reflection. Community gatherings discussed both the crime and the broader implications, the hidden dangers in familiar surroundings, the importance of observation, and the necessity of collective vigilance. Candlelight vigils were held not only in remembrance of Emily, but as acts of communal catharsis, a way for residents to process decades of anxiety and grief. Families shared stories of subtle fears, fleeting suspicions, and moments that, in hindsight, had been overlooked. These conversations, once muted or dismissed, became important threads in the city's ongoing dialogue about safety, memory, and resilience. Psychologists and social workers emphasize the long-term effects of unresolved trauma on communities, noting that cold cases leave invisible scars that persist beyond individual grief. Residents recalled the tension of childhood spent with uncertainty, the unspoken awareness that someone had vanished nearby, that danger could exist quietly in the shadows. In schools, educators incorporated lessons derived from Emily's story, not merely as cautionary tales but as prompts for critical thinking, observation, and community responsibility. Students were guided to understand the nuanced balance between awareness and fear, empowerment and caution, personal agency and communal accountability. Detectives, though relieved by resolution, found themselves revisiting patterns of the past, reflecting on decisions made, methodologies applied, and the relentless patience required to maintain focus over decades. The confession, while climactic, was one aspect of a broader process of understanding, reconstructing, and learning. Evidence that had once seemed peripheral, an overlooked fiber, an ambiguous witness statement, a faint trace on an alley wall, was reevaluated, analyzed in light of modern techniques, and incorporated into a holistic understanding of the crime. Forensic analysts prepared comprehensive reports, not only for prosecution but for educational purposes, ensuring that the methods and insights gained from this cold case would inform law enforcement practices for generations. The man's meticulous concealment, his ordinary facade, became case studies in behavioral analysis, demonstrating the interplay between patience, calculation, and the human tendency to overlook the mundane. Meanwhile, Emily Sanders' family navigated the complex terrain of grief tempered by closure. Her parents, long accustomed to absence, now faced the duality of finality and enduring loss. Memories long deferred surfaced vividly, moments once dismissed or forgotten resurfacing with painful clarity. Friends and relatives participated in commemorative events, reconnecting after years apart, drawn together by the shared experience of loss and the slow emergence of understanding. Media coverage remained intense, though gradually shifting from the sensationalism of confession to the reflective aspects of societal impact. Documentaries, articles, and interviews highlighted not only the crime but the community's response, the psychological repercussions, and the perseverance of investigators who had never relinquished their pursuit of truth. In neighborhoods, conversations among residents acknowledged subtle changes in perception and behavior. Individuals recounted stories of moments that had once seemed trivial: a shadow in a hallway, a van parked unusually long, a passerby's lingering glance, that now, in retrospect, revealed the hidden rhythms of a predator operating in plain sight. The case became an exemplar of both human malevolence and human tenacity. Lectures and workshops were organized to disseminate knowledge gained from the investigation. Law enforcement officials emphasized the importance of meticulous documentation, cross-referencing evidence, technological advancements, and interagency cooperation. The cold case served as a pedagogical tool, illustrating the intricate balance between patience, innovation, and procedural rigor required to resolve long-standing mysteries. Within the precinct, detectives engaged in reflective analysis. Each member evaluated decisions made, evidence collected, and hypotheses formed. The confession validated their theories, yet also prompted deeper inquiry into the cognitive and behavioral dimensions of the suspect. Interviews and psychological assessments provided insight into the mind of someone capable of sustaining deception over decades, offering lessons in detection, pattern recognition, and behavioral inference. Meanwhile, the city absorbed the aftermath. Chicagoans reflected on the fragility of perceived safety, the hidden presence of danger in familiar spaces, and the importance of communal vigilance. Conversations in cafes, offices, and schools gravitated toward memory, analysis, and empathy, creating a citywide engagement with the narrative of loss and resolution. Emily Sanders' story transcended her family and friends, becoming emblematic of persistence, resilience, and the slow but inexorable pursuit of justice. Her life, though tragically cut short, informed public discourse, professional methodology, and communal reflection. As winter gave way to spring, neighborhoods that had been haunted by uncertainty began small acts of reclaiming ordinary life. Children playing under streetlights once avoided, neighbors organizing block gatherings, families walking through familiar paths that had been shadowed by fear. Yet even in the apparent restoration of normalcy, the psychological residue remained. Subtle reminders: the alley, the building, the corner bench, carried memory, reflection, and caution. Residents navigated these spaces with both wariness and hope, a recognition that closure does not erase impact. Detectives continued to compile their findings, integrating confession details, forensic evidence, witness recollections, and behavioral analysis into exhaustive files. These reports served multiple purposes: legal, educational, psychological, and historical. They ensured that every nuance, every subtle trace, every fragment of the 25-year investigation would be preserved for reference and reflection. Emily's family participated actively in remembrance efforts, advocating for safety awareness, supporting educational programs, and contributing to public dialogue. Their engagement transformed personal tragedy into societal benefit, reinforcing the notion that even in loss, proactive efforts can shape the community's understanding and resilience. Media retrospectives emphasize lessons learned, the importance of observing the ordinary, the need for persistent investigation, the value of technological innovation, and the emotional complexity inherent in cold cases. Analysts highlighted how seemingly inconsequential details, moments ignored, statements overlooked, evidence misfiled, can, when reconsidered with patience and rigor, unlock mysteries long considered unsolvable. And yet, for all the closure achieved, the city's collective consciousness retained a shadow. The memory of Emily Sanders, the reality of her absence, the horror of the crime, and the extraordinary patience of the perpetrator lingered invisibly, shaping perceptions, conversations, and behaviors. Chicago's residents navigated ordinary life while carrying this nuanced understanding of risk, observation, and resilience. Streets and neighborhoods were infused with both memory and caution, ordinary routines tempered by reflection. Detectives reflected privately on the human dimensions of their work: empathy, persistence, understanding the interplay between ordinary life and concealed malevolence. They recognized that investigation is as much about human psychology, memory, and perception as it is about evidence, forensics, and procedure. The man's confession had ended the legal ambiguity, but psychological and communal repercussions endured. Counseling sessions, family interventions, and community programs addressed trauma, grief, and the lingering tension of unresolved fear. Scholars analyze the case as a phenomenon of social psychology, law enforcement strategy, and communal memory. Lessons were drawn not merely from the crime itself but from the societal ripples caused by its decades-long concealment and ultimate revelation. Meanwhile, in everyday life, small signs of recovery emerged. Children played again in alleyways, albeit with awareness instilled through education and conversation. Neighbors greeted one another with renewed communication, sharing observations, ensuring collective safety. Families revisited familiar locations, reclaiming spaces once shadowed by absence and fear. Emily Sanders' legacy became a catalyst for vigilance, resilience, and community cohesion. The detectives, having navigated decades of uncertainty, now engaged in mentorship, training, and consultation, ensuring that the methodologies honed through this cold case would influence future investigations, inform forensic and behavioral analysis, and provide a framework for addressing long unsolved crimes. The city, though scarred, demonstrated remarkable capacity for adaptation and reflection. Streets, parks, and neighborhoods bore the psychological weight of history, but also the resilience of collective memory and action. Emily's story, once a void, now stood as a narrative bridge between loss and understanding, trauma and closure, horror and vigilance, influencing the city's consciousness, law enforcement practices, and public awareness. And in moments of quiet reflection, early mornings in the fog, late nights in empty streets, solitary walks past familiar corners, the city's residents could sense the lingering presence of absence and resolution, a subtle, invisible thread connecting the past to the present, grief to understanding, and memory to vigilance. Emily Sanders' story had been told, the confession delivered, the case closed, yet the psychological and emotional resonance endured, shaping Chicago's collective memory, influencing behavior, and reminding all who walk those streets that even in ordinary spaces, history, loss, and the enduring pursuit of truth leave indelible marks, echoes of shadows long past, and lessons for generations yet to come. The city's pulse seemed to slow in the aftermath of the confession, as though Chicago itself was pausing to absorb the weight of decades of silence finally broken. Inside the precinct, detectives moved quietly, cataloging evidence, reviewing reports, and reconciling the monumental closure with the subtle, lingering unease that always accompanies cases of such magnitude. Every fiber, every strand of hair, every trace of soil meticulously collected 25 years ago, had finally converged with the confession to form a coherent narrative. Yet despite the resolution, the psychological imprint of the crime endured. The man, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in his capacity for concealment, had left a trail of consequences far beyond the immediate tragedy. Detectives revisited every minor clue, every forgotten detail, aware that the case file, now technically closed, contained lessons and warnings essential for future investigations. The confession had answered questions, yet it also revealed gaps in understanding, areas where human perception had faltered, where the passage of time had obscured subtle truths. Forensic analysts reconvened, poring over decades-old samples with modern technology, uncovering previously undetectable traces that painted a more vivid picture of the night Emily Sanders vanished. The fibers matched precisely, the DNA sequencing confirmed relationships previously theorized but unproven, and soil analysis connected the suspect to specific locations he had claimed to never visit. Each finding strengthened the narrative, providing closure for investigators yet simultaneously reinforcing the chilling reality of how meticulously a predator can operate in plain sight. In parallel, Emily's family continued to navigate the profound complexity of closure. The relief of finally knowing the truth was intertwined with renewed grief, intensified by the vivid reconstruction of her final hours. Photographs, personal effects, and memories became anchors in a sea of conflicting emotions, reminders of loss, yet symbols of resilience and enduring love. Friends and extended family gathered, sharing recollections once scattered across decades. Laughter emerged cautiously alongside tears, a delicate balance between mourning and commemoration. Outside, the city slowly reclaimed its rhythm. Streets, parks, and familiar corners resumed their usual functions, yet subtle traces of vigilance remained. Residents had internalized the lessons of the case. Shadows in alleys, unusual behaviors, and small anomalies no longer went unnoticed. The story of Emily Sanders had become embedded in the collective consciousness, a cautionary tale, a memory, and a marker of the persistence required to confront hidden threats. Community leaders organized events not only to honor Emily's memory, but also to educate citizens about awareness and safety. Neighborhood watch programs gained renewed attention, and conversations in public spaces often returned to the themes of vigilance, empathy, and communal responsibility. Psychologists noted the generational impact. Children who had grown up during the years of uncertainty carried subtle behavioral patterns shaped by the invisible presence of danger. These patterns persisted even after resolution, illustrating the enduring influence of long unsolved crimes on societal behavior. Within the precinct, the detectives engaged in exhaustive reviews of procedures and strategy. The confession offered critical insight into the methods and mindset of someone capable of evading justice for decades. Behavioral analysts studied his routines, psychological evaluations highlighted cognitive strategies, and investigative techniques were scrutinized for lessons applicable to future cold cases. The man's ordinary facade became a focal point in training sessions, emphasizing the need for awareness, skepticism, and the careful evaluation of seemingly mundane behaviors. Legal proceedings moved forward with deliberate precision. Prosecutors meticulously constructed a case integrating confession, forensic evidence, and corroborating witness testimony. Every document, report, and analysis was cross-referenced, ensuring that the decades-long investigation culminated in a trial reflecting both procedural integrity and the gravity of the crime. Courtrooms were prepared for the intensity of public attention, balancing transparency with sensitivity to the victim's family and the community at large. Media coverage oscillated between the fascination with confession, the relief of closure, and the reflective discourse on societal implications. Documentaries and feature stories emphasized procedural innovation, technological advances, and the extraordinary patience required to resolve cases that had gone cold for decades. Experts dissected behavioral patterns, forensic breakthroughs, and community impact, offering both cautionary tales and guidance for future investigations. Emily Sanders' story continued to resonate across multiple layers of society. Her narrative became a reference point in educational programs, law enforcement training, and community awareness initiatives. The interplay between trauma, perseverance, and eventual resolution offered profound lessons in resilience, vigilance, and the enduring quest for justice. Yet despite the official closure, a subtle, pervasive tension persisted. Residents recounted lingering unease, fleeting moments of fear triggered by familiar streets, and reflective thoughts on the fragility of perceived safety. The psychological aftereffects of the crime underscored the fact that closure in the legal sense does not erase memory, does not restore lost time, and does not fully remove the shadows left in its wake. Detectives documented these reflections, recognizing that understanding the broader social and psychological implications of cold cases was essential for comprehensive investigative practice. Emily's parents navigated these layers of experience with careful attention to both personal healing and public engagement. They participated in interviews, public talks, and community events, transforming their grief into a tool for awareness, education, and societal benefit. Every conversation, every public appearance, served as both commemoration and preventive measure, a testament to the enduring relevance of their daughter's story. Analysts, journalists, and historians revisited the case repeatedly, highlighting how minute details overlooked for decades, an errant fiber, a vague witness recollection, a fleeting security camera image, had ultimately proven critical. These reflections reinforced the necessity of meticulous record-keeping, cross-referencing, and the integration of modern technologies with traditional investigative techniques. Meanwhile, neighborhoods gradually reclaimed a sense of safety. Children played with renewed freedom, neighbors communicated more openly, and communal spaces became centers for memory, reflection, and engagement. Yet the city remained subtly imprinted by the events. The psychological and social landscape had shifted permanently, informed by the decades-long absence of closure and the eventual emergence of truth. Detectives reflected privately on the human dimension of their work, recognizing the interplay between patience, empathy, analytical rigor, and resilience. The case had demanded extraordinary dedication, not only in the accumulation of evidence but also in understanding the human elements, the grief, the fear, the subtle signs, and the psychological ramifications of unresolved trauma. As the trial approached, prosecutors emphasized both the evidentiary strength and the societal significance of the case. Expert witnesses detailed behavioral analysis, forensic advancements, and the methodology employed over decades. The narrative presented in court was comprehensive, weaving together confession, evidence, psychological insight, and historical context. Outside the courtroom, public discourse continued. Citizens reflected on the broader implications of cold cases, the importance of community vigilance, and the profound impact long unresolved crimes have on social cohesion and psychological well-being. Discussions ranged from technical aspects of forensic science to the more intangible effects on memory, trust, and communal identity. Emily Sanders' legacy, though rooted in tragedy, became emblematic of both caution and resilience. Her story illustrated the extraordinary lengths required to pursue justice, the subtleties of human behavior that can conceal malevolence, and the enduring need for societal vigilance. In homes, offices, and schools, her memory prompted reflection, empathy, and a subtle recalibration of perceptions regarding safety, awareness, and human complexity. Detectives and analysts continued to refine their understanding of procedural efficacy. Lessons learned from the case informed protocols, training, and investigative priorities, ensuring that the methodologies developed and employed could be applied to future cold cases, enhancing both efficiency and effectiveness. And as the city moved forward, the psychological and emotional resonance of Emily Sanders' story persisted. The confession had resolved legal ambiguity, but the subtle echoes of trauma, fear, and reflection endured in the streets, neighborhoods, and consciousness of Chicagoans. The balance between closure and ongoing impact was delicate, highlighting the profound societal dimensions of crimes that remain unresolved for decades. The precinct maintained a quiet vigilance, reviewing every aspect of the case, ensuring that every lesson, every detail, every nuance was preserved. This ongoing reflection underscored the enduring value of meticulous investigation, patience, and the integration of human insight with technological innovation. Emily Sanders' story, now fully documented and analyzed, served as both a memorial and a guidepost, a reminder that even in ordinary streets, unseen dangers can persist, and that the pursuit of truth requires persistence, collaboration, and unwavering moral resolve. And as night fell over Chicago, the city, bathed in streetlight and shadow, carried the memory of the cold case, the confession, and the long shadow of absence. Residents slept under the subtle weight of awareness, children dreamed, families reconciled grief and closure, and detectives prepared for the procedural next steps. The resolution had arrived, yet the echoes of Emily Sanders' life, disappearance, and the extraordinary patience of justice reverberated through every alley, corner, and street. A city had been forever marked, a family transformed, and a community reminded of the delicate balance between ordinary life and the hidden shadows that sometimes inhabit it. The story was concluded in the records, resolved in the courts, and commemorated in memory, yet the psychological and societal impact endured, a lasting testament to the persistence of truth, the vigilance of justice, and the enduring resonance of a life interrupted but never forgotten. The city seemed to exhale cautiously, almost reluctantly, as news of the confession circulated beyond precinct walls and into the streets, homes, and hearts of Chicagoans who had long carried a quiet tension, an unspoken fear rooted in the absence of resolution. Emily Sanders' name, once whispered in hushed tones, now rang out with clarity, weight, and consequence. Detectives walked the precinct corridors, notes in hand, minds replaying decades of procedural rigor, fragmented clues, and faint glimmers of insight that had accumulated slowly, meticulously, into the undeniable truth. Each member understood that the confession, while monumental, was but a pivot in a vast web of human experience, trauma, grief, reflection, vigilance, all intertwined and rendered more vivid by time. Families and neighborhoods near the site of Emily's disappearance convened in quiet discussion, sharing stories that had been suppressed or overlooked for years. Children recounted vague recollections, adults recalled fleeting observations, and collectively, they began to reconstruct a shared memory of fear, uncertainty, and resilience. Conversations once muted by uncertainty now carried the weight of understanding, the capacity for acknowledgement and education, the subtle realization that ordinary moments can hide extraordinary significance. Emily's parents, grappling with the intensity of closure, navigated a turbulent terrain of grief layered over relief. Mornings brought reflections, afternoons carried bursts of memory, and evenings often fell into silence heavy with contemplation. Photographs, mementos, and personal effects became both comfort and reminder, anchors in a reality simultaneously painful and affirming, tangible connections to a life disrupted, yet indelibly present in the minds of those who loved her. Friends reunited, reconnecting across decades, sharing stories once forgotten or dismissed, laughter now entwined with tears, creating a delicate tapestry of memory and commemoration. Neighborhood gatherings emerged as small acts of collective processing. Candlelight vigils illuminated parks and alleyways, offering a tangible acknowledgement of both absence and resilience. Residents shared insights, fears, and moments of intuition previously ignored, transforming communal anxiety into actionable awareness and a subtle reclaiming of spaces once shadowed by uncertainty. Detectives, meanwhile, remained vigilant in analysis, revisiting minor details, re-examining timelines, and exploring the psychological depth revealed in the suspect's confession. Every motion, hesitation, and articulation was catalogued, offering insight into the extraordinary patience, calculation, and facade maintained over decades. Forensic evidence was reprocessed with modern techniques, ensuring that even the minutest trace reinforced the comprehensive understanding of the crime. Fibers, DNA, soil analysis, and behavioral patterns were meticulously integrated, creating a layered narrative that was legally robust and psychologically illuminating. Media coverage continued, now shifting from sensational revelation to reflective exploration. Documentaries and in-depth analyses dissected procedural innovation, investigative patience, and the human cost of long unresolved crime. Experts in criminal psychology, law enforcement, and social behavior contributed, highlighting both the complexity of human concealment and the perseverance required to penetrate decades of silence. Emily Sanders' story resonated across social networks, schools, and professional forums, serving as both cautionary tale and emblem of perseverance. Students explored the implications for awareness and personal safety, while law enforcement professionals shared insights to enhance methodology and vigilance. In neighborhoods, daily life slowly reclaimed rhythm, yet subtle vigilance persisted. Children played, neighbors communicated openly, and communal spaces were revisited with cautious optimism. The city's physical fabric, ordinary yet now imbued with memory, bore traces of both trauma and resilience. Detectives reflected on the enduring implications of the case. The confession had illuminated method, intent, and concealment, yet the psychological and social dimensions remained vast. They engaged in workshops, mentoring sessions, and analytical discussions, extracting lessons not only for procedural success but for the understanding of human behavior, memory, and the societal effects of unresolved trauma. Emily's parents became public voices, participating in interviews, community outreach, and awareness programs. Their grief transformed into advocacy, providing insight, guidance, and a tangible example of resilience and proactive engagement. Every appearance, every narrative shared, became a tool for both commemoration and prevention. Legal teams prepared meticulously for trial, integrating confession, corroborative evidence, and historical context. Witnesses were reviewed, timelines refined, and documentation cross-referenced. Every detail was significant, every nuance considered, ensuring that decades of investigation were translated into a courtroom narrative both precise and compelling. The community continued to process the psychological ramifications of long unresolved fear. Parents guided children in awareness and observation, neighbors discussed vigilance and trust, and individuals internalized lessons in perception and reflection. The social fabric, subtly altered over decades, began to weave itself anew, informed by experience, caution, and resilience. Emily Sanders' memory became a symbol of patience in investigation, of the capacity for human malevolence to hide in ordinary facades, and of the enduring power of truth to transform fear into understanding. Streets, alleys, and parks carried memory and caution, but also the quiet promise of resilience. Detectives documented these societal echoes, recognizing that the impact of a cold case transcends the immediate crime, extending into communal consciousness, psychological patterns, and cultural awareness. Analysis highlighted the interplay between human perception, memory, and the subtle signals often overlooked in daily life, underscoring the importance of vigilance, reflection, and empathy. And yet, even with closure, the subtle shadows of fear and memory persisted. Residents occasionally recalled fleeting moments from years past. A van parked unusually long, a passerby's lingering glance, or a shadow in a familiar alley. These recollections, once dismissed, now carried profound significance. They served as reminders of the hidden rhythms of human behavior and the quiet persistence of unresolved suspicion. Within the precinct, detectives reflected on their role as custodians not only of justice but of memory. The confession, while resolving legal ambiguity, could not erase the psychological imprint of decades of uncertainty. Counseling sessions, reflective discussions, and peer support became essential components of processing the extraordinary human dimensions revealed through the investigation. Emily Sanders' friends reconnected and reconciled with loss, shared stories and reflections that had been long dormant. Moments of laughter intertwined with grief, anecdotes once trivial became touchstones for memory and commemoration. Public gatherings, vigils, and memorials reinforced communal awareness, education, and reflection, transforming collective grief into proactive vigilance. Legal proceedings approached with precision, ensuring that the case's decades-long complexity was fully articulated and contextualized in court. Expert testimony, behavioral analysis, and forensic corroboration provided a comprehensive understanding of both the crime and the perpetrator's methods. Media narratives, while still covering the case, increasingly emphasized education, reflection, and societal implications rather than shock or sensationalism. Emily Sanders' legacy permeated Chicago in subtle, yet profound ways. Streets, neighborhoods, and social interactions carried the imprint of memory, caution, and reflection. Ordinary life resumed, but awareness remained, a quiet vigilance embedded in routines, observation, and communal discourse. Detectives, analysts, and social scientists documented the enduring lessons: the necessity of meticulous evidence collection, the integration of modern forensic technologies, and the value of persistent, patient investigation over decades. And through it all, the human dimension persisted. Grief, memory, reflection, and resilience intertwined with vigilance, empathy, and procedural rigor. Emily Sanders' story, resolved yet haunting, became a living narrative, a bridge connecting absence with understanding, fear with resolution, trauma with learning, and loss with enduring impact. As Chicago moved forward, residents, families, and law enforcement carried the story in their consciousness, a constant, quiet presence shaping perception, behavior, and communal awareness. The confession had closed a chapter legally, yet psychologically, socially, and emotionally, the narrative remained vivid, a persistent echo of tragedy, perseverance, and the enduring quest for truth. In the quiet of early mornings, the city absorbed the subtle resonance of memory, reflection, and vigilance. Streets held stories, corners carried echoes, and the collective consciousness remained imprinted with the shadow and light of Emily Sanders' life, disappearance, and the extraordinary resolution that had spanned a quarter-century. Closure had arrived, justice had been served, yet the haunting presence of history, memory, and human resilience lingered, embedding lessons, reflection, and vigilance into the very fabric of the city. Emily Sanders' story, once shrouded in absence, had emerged fully into light, yet its shadows remained, a reminder that truth, persistence, and justice leave traces far beyond procedural resolution, enduring in streets, hearts, and memories for generations to come. Even as the city exhaled, slowly, almost tentatively, Chicago's collective consciousness remained marked, etched by the memory of Emily Sanders and the extraordinary path that had led from disappearance to confession. Streets that once seemed ordinary now carried a weight, a subtle tension beneath everyday life, as if the air itself remembered the decades-long uncertainty, the pervasive fear, the quiet vigilance born of absence. Detectives walked familiar corridors in the precinct, the echo of their footsteps intermingling with recollections of conversations, witness statements, and minute details that had once seemed inconsequential, now revealed as critical threads in a complex tapestry of concealment and revelation. Each file, photograph, and scrap of evidence became more than documentation. It became a testament to patience, persistence, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The man who had confessed, ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in his capacity for secrecy and deception, became a central figure not only in legal proceedings but in broader reflections on human behavior. Analysts dissected his methods, psychologists examined his mindset, and law enforcement officers considered the delicate balance between intuition and procedural rigor that had eventually allowed decades of silence to be pierced. For Emily's family, the confession brought relief that was immediately entangled with renewed grief, intensified by the clarity of the timeline, the vivid reconstruction of her final hours, and the stark acknowledgement of what had been irretrievably lost. Photographs, journals, and personal items became repositories of memory, imbued with both sorrow and resilience, tangible connections to a life ended far too soon, yet indelibly present in the hearts of those who loved her. Friends long separated by time and circumstance, reunited, sharing fragmented recollections, memories sharpened by decades of reflection, anecdotes once trivial now imbued with significance. The process of collective remembrance became an act of communal healing, blending grief with acknowledgement, sorrow with celebration of Emily's life, and reflection with proactive engagement in awareness and safety. Neighborhoods once permeated by subtle anxiety gradually reclaimed spaces, yet the imprint of history lingered. Alleyways, parks, and street corners carried stories, shadows, and whispers of the past. Candlelight vigils, educational programs, and community meetings became vehicles for reconciliation, memory, and vigilance, turning trauma into collective resilience. The precinct engaged in ongoing analysis, revisiting every minor detail, evaluating investigative techniques, and ensuring that every lesson gleaned from decades of perseverance was captured and shared. Behavioral analysis, forensic innovation, and strategic documentation were synthesized into comprehensive training materials for future investigations, emphasizing that even the smallest overlooked details can hold the key to long unsolved mysteries. Media coverage shifted subtly from sensational revelation to reflective documentation,